What's up, everybody? I'm here with an unscripted review for Bramble the Mountain King. Bramble is a horror action-adventure platformer that tells the story of a brother and sister set in the world of Nordic fables. Ole, the main character, is the younger brother who must rescue his older sister when she is kidnapped by a troll in the forest after they are screwing around at night in the dark, like kids do. Doing so takes him on a perilous journey through a world full of mythological creatures and dangerous environments that will brutally kill the player. This game is very similar to Little Nightmares and other games of that genre. Little Nightmares 2, obviously. The art direction, I think, is one of the coolest aspects of this game. Obviously, there's a little bit of a disconnect between the concept art and the actual art. I don't know what engine this is made in, but it's 3D. It's kind of like a 2.5D/3D because you do actually move around in 3 dimensions on multiple occasions. But a lot of the time, there's like only one path you can take, and it feels like a 2.5D game, like a side-scroller. On the topic of the concept art, this game does a very good job of visual storytelling, in my opinion. And it's not just visual storytelling, but it does actually narrate and tell you the story, unlike games such as Little Nightmares, where it's entirely environmental and contextual storytelling with no dialogue whatsoever. This game does have a narrator, not only during the storybook moments, but there are multiple sections where the narrator will intercede during cutscenes and explain what's going on. Primarily, though, the story is told through these storybooks. They're spread out throughout the game. Each time you get to a new chapter or a new major point, you'll discover a storybook that tells what's going on in the confines of like a storybook that you would read to a kid. And you actually flip the pages in game and read each page of the story as you flip. A lot of times you will actually go into an environment and kind of get an idea of what's going on before you discover those storybooks, and then they confirm the actual story. All in all, I think it's a really cool method of visual storytelling, which sets it apart from other games in the genre because they do actually explain to you what's going on. I have so many questions still about Little Nightmares that I don't understand the answers to, even if I read them, and I haven't. But this game doesn't force you to do that. It will actually just tell you up front what the deal is. In addition to all the world building, there's a lot. The whole soundtrack is basically Nordic music and maybe some Germanic at the end, but the soundtrack helps create an interesting environment, and it feels authentic that it is like a mythological Nordic environment, and you've got people singing songs. I'm not sure what language, but it fits. I'm assuming that they're in whatever language. I don't know wherever the developer is from, probably language from around that region. The environmental storytelling, in addition to the actual storytelling, is excellent. Whether it's the colors that are used or the actual art design. Like, there's a point where you discover a village set on the edge of this forest that's been almost completely burned down, and then you encounter all these hanging dead bodies off of trees and off of like a T-cross. You don't actually read the story of what happened until you get about halfway through the level, but you are basically left to guess for yourself. And I really appreciate that element of the storytelling as well as outright telling you. As stated, Bramble is a platformer, so Bramble has your standard platforming mechanics, so you're going to spend a lot of time jumping onto and between platforms, mushrooms, wooden platforms, planks, rooftops, rocks, whatever the case is, in addition to obviously climbing up walls, vines, nets, things like that. And obviously, you would also have your wall jumping, where you have to jump off of a thing that you're climbing on onto another thing, or you have to jump between moving objects before they fall down. And then in addition to the normal platforming, then you also have like puzzle platforming, where you have to move an object, jump on it, or you have to move an object that has a timed movement animation, and then you have to jump on that and then jump off of it onto something else while it's moving. Or you have to time your jumps to use moving cover, or time your jumps to avoid enemy attacks. Some sections of the game involve some very light stealth mechanics, like hiding in grass or not making noise. But these only happen in very short bursts and aren't seen again for a long time in the game. Really only into specific chapters. And they're very lenient. It's almost impossible to die from doing stealth wrong. As expected for a game in this genre, there are a few chase sequences. None of them are overly difficult, although one does rely almost entirely on memorization, so you will probably die a few times before figuring out the perfect path to take. Unlike a game like Little Nightmares, they don't really put obstacles in your way during the chase sequences, so it's not as difficult. Another major difference between this game and many other games in this genre is that it does include some light puzzle solving on the level of an older Resident Evil or Silent Hill game. However, none of these puzzles are really difficult, and just like the old Resident Evil games, the solutions are basically right in front of your face, so you just have to figure them out. So it never takes very long. The longest puzzle in the game is in the last 15 minutes. It is a cool element, I think, and I really appreciate that they put in some old school survival horror roots. There is one puzzle in the game that is very similar, and it almost feels like an homage to several older Resident Evil games, where there were some puzzles where you had to actually look at paintings on the wall and determine what order to put the, whatever the associated number was, or the associated item. And in fact, Resident Evil 8 actually had one in the very beginning section in the castle. There was a very similar painting puzzle. So as a survival horror fan and as a Resident Evil fan, I personally appreciate it. I thought they could have done more puzzle solving in the game, but I do understand it was meant to be a rather short horror platformer rather than a full-fledged survival horror game. One of the main things that differentiates this game from something like Little Nightmares is that it actually has combat, if you can even call it that, because the combat only exists in the game during boss fights. Other than one or two specific instances outside of that, the only other way you can actually actively use the glowing ball thingy is to attack Bramble, which is more of just a platforming element than it is combat. On the topic of boss fights, there are a few bosses in the game. None of the encounters are particularly creative or difficult, and they don't require a complete mastery of the game mechanics, but they are interesting and they are challenging and brief enough that they aren't overly frustrating, but they aren't overly simple at the same time. They all tie into the story, and they all are pretty fun. The last boss fight especially is a primary reason why I like this game. It has nothing to do with the gameplay. That's not true. It has more to do with the soundtrack than the actual gameplay, but the boss encounter itself is remotely decent. I mean, it's a combination of a lot of old school arcade mechanics. I wouldn't even say that it's the best boss fight in the game, but I just felt like the soundtrack and the game mechanics and basically the situation of the boss encounter combined made it into the coolest boss encounter in the game, although not the most challenging. All that said, Bramble is a short indie game, very similar to Little Nightmares, and if you're a fan of horror games, of puzzle platformers, it's not obscenely priced. The game will only take you 4 hours to beat. Maybe a little bit longer than that to completely get all the achievements, if that's the way that you do things. I've seen people beat it in less than 2 hours. You will probably have to redo sections multiple times, so you will be able to beat it that quickly eventually, just because you're going to die. There is no achievement for beating it as quickly as possible, so I mean, there's not really any reason to take your time, but it is not going to take you more than 6 hours to beat this game. It does some new and creative things that other games in the genre, the specific subgenre, haven't done that I've seen. So I do think it's unique to some extent. But I absolutely recommend the game. It has a great soundtrack. It has great graphics. Some of the art is kind of weird, but even being weird, it still ties into being a mythological Nordic game. The gameplay is fun. It's not hair-pulling. And the story is pretty cool too. So again, I recommend the game. I already bought it on Steam, even though I played it the first time on Game Pass. It's on sale everywhere right now for about $20. So regardless of where you buy it, Steam or Windows Store or on Xbox, it should only set you back about $25 for the Super Deluxe Edition.